Is keto safe? Or are what we are being told a version of a story that leaves out some important context? Because depending on who you listen to, a ketogenic diet is either one of the most effective tools for fat loss and metabolic health, or something you should avoid entirely. So, which is it? Today, we're going to break down what safe actually means, the biggest problems with the research used to criticize keto, and how to think about risk the right way. So let's first get this out of the way. I am not a doctor, and this is not medical advice. But I am a 55-year-old man who used a ketogenic, animal based approach to lose and maintain roughly 100 pounds over the last 8 years. And in that time, I reversed my morbid obesity, my pre diabetic state, and my hypertension. I rebuilt strength, added muscle, ran a sub 8 minute mile for the first time in decades, and recently deadlifted 500 pounds. So when I ask whether keto is safe, I'm not asking as someone theorizing on the internet. I'm asking as someone who has lived this. See, safety isn't about precaution, it's about risk compared to the alternative. Now, before we get into the studies or opinions, we need to define the question properly. Because asking, is keto safe without context, the real problem? The real question is safe compared to what? Is keto compared to the standard is keto safe compared to the standard American diet, which is high in processed foods, sugar, and constant snacking? Is it safe compared to living with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and the long list of self-inflicted comorbidities that come with it? Is it safe compared to being on multiple medications that only manage symptoms and don't actually fix the underlying problem? Or is it being compared to some theoretical perfect diet that almost nobody follows in the real world? Because those are very different comparisons. And this is where a lot of the conversation breaks down. When people say keto isn't safe, they're often comparing it to an ideal. But when people actually adopt keto, they're usually coming from something very different. Years of poor metabolic health, weight gain, and failed attempts at other approaches. So for me, and maybe for you, the question isn't, is keto perfectly safe? It's, is keto safer, excuse me, than the path that I'm currently on? Now, let's talk about one of the biggest problems in this entire conversation, the research. Because if you start digging into the studies used to criticize keto or carnivore, you'll notice something pretty quickly. A lot of them aren't actually studying what most of us would call a true ketogenic diet. A real ketogenic diet typically requires keeping carbohydrates under about 50 grams per day, often even lower, to actually produce a state of ketosis. But many of these studies label something as low carb or even keto, while participants are still eating 100, 125, even 150 grams of carbohydrates a day. Gentlemen, that's not ketosis. And in many cases, they're not even measuring whether participants are even in ketosis at all. On top of that, adherence is often self-reported, which means we don't really know what people were consistently eating. And then there's food quality. See, there's a big difference between a whole food, animal-based ketogenic diet and a processed, packaged keto diet full of low-carb junk food. But many of these studies don't even control for that either. So when you see headlines saying keto is unsafe, you have to ask yourself a very simple question. Were these people actually doing keto? Or were they doing a loose, poorly controlled version of it that never even reached a state of ketosis in the first place? Now, when you look at where a lot of the criticism of keto comes from, it tends to fall into two very broad categories. The first group includes organizations like the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. These groups are often strongly aligned with vegan, plant-based approaches, not just for health reasons, but also for so-called ethical and environmental considerations. Now, that doesn't automatically make them wrong, but it does mean they're approaching nutrition from a very specific framework. And if your priorities are different, if you're focused on metabolic health, strength, and sustainability in your own personal life, you may not arrive at the same conclusions. Now, the second group is what I like to call institutional medicine. Organizations like the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology. These organizations create guidelines meant to apply to entire populations. And that's important. But it also means they are optimizing for broad risk reduction across millions of people. They are not necessarily optimizing for the individual who is already metabolically unhealthy, overweight, or struggling with type 2 diabetes and the self-inflicted comorbidities that come with it. So again, the question becomes, are these guidelines designed for someone in your exact situation? Or are they designed for the average population written on paper? Because that distinction matters more than most people realize. Now, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, cholesterol. Because this is where most of the fear around keto comes from. So the common argument goes like this. If your LDL cholesterol goes up, your risk of heart disease also goes up. And since some people on keto see an increase in LDL, that alone must mean keto is unsafe. That sounds simple. In fact, it sounds so simple that it might actually be too simplistic, because the reality is not that simple. Cholesterol is not just one number. It's much part of a larger metabolic system. See, you have LDL, HDL, triglycerides, particle size, metabolic health, inflammation, insulin levels. These all interact. And what we often see on a well-formulated ketogenic diet is triglycerides go down, HDL goes up, blood sugar improves, and your body fat decreases. So now the question becomes, what matters more, the change in a single marker or the overall improvement in metabolic health? Because while LDL is a risk marker, it's not the only variable in the system. And treating it like it is oversimplifies a very complex issue, which is your own personal metabolic health. Now, to understand where this cholesterol fear comes from, we have to go back in time. Much of the diet heart hypothesis was influenced by researchers like Ansel Keys. But that work was observational. It showed correlation, not causation. And it's also been heavily criticized because not all available data was included. Some countries that didn't even fit the hypothesis were excluded. That's one of the reasons why it remains controversial. Now, you compare that to something like the Minnesota coronary experiment. This was a controlled trial where saturated fats were replaced with vegetable oils to see if lowering cholesterol would reduce heart disease risk. And what happened? Cholesterol levels went down, but mortality did not improve. And in some analysis, greater reductions in cholesterol were actually associated with higher mortality. And even more interesting, The full data wasn't completely analyzed and published until decades later. So, what does that tell us? It doesn't prove the opposite is true, but it does challenge the idea that lowering cholesterol automatically leads to better outcomes. And that's a much more nuanced conversation than most headlines suggest. So, after all of this, studies, cholesterol debates, conflicting opinions, what actually matters? Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about data. It's about results in the real world. Are you losing excess body fat? Are your blood sugar levels improving? Are you reducing reliance on medications? Are you gaining strength, energy, mobility? And most importantly, can you sustain what you're doing long term? In other words, is your personal quality of life improving on a ketogenic or carnivore lifestyle? Because a whole food, well-formulated ketogenic diet is very different from a processed version filled with packaged foods. And gentlemen, context matters. If someone is coming from years of poor metabolic health, obesity, and type 2 diabetes, and then improving those markers may matter more than chasing a single lab value in isolation. So instead of asking, is keto safe in theory, a better question might be, is what I'm doing now working? And if not, is this a better path forward? Now, before we wrap this up, we need to talk about something very important. Because even though keto can be a powerful tool, it's not risk-free for everyone. So if you are taking medications, especially for blood sugar, you need to pay close attention because lowering carbohydrates can lower blood sugar quickly. And that means your medications may need to change. That's not something you want to guess your way through. And this is where I want to say something directly, especially to the men watching this. You cannot afford to be passive when it comes to your health. Too many people take a just tell me what to do approach without ever having a real conversation. Now, there are great doctors out there. I had one who supported me. But you have to be your own best advocate. That means, gentlemen, being direct. That means saying, listen, doctor, this is the direction I'm going. I want to improve my health. I want to reduce my reliance on medication. And I want you involved because as my body changes, my medications may need to change too. Gentlemen, that's not being rebellious. That's being responsible. And it creates something powerful. Because when a doctor sees a patient come back months later, down 30, 40, 50 pounds, with improved labs, on fewer medications, that is real world data. That is called an N of 1 experiment. And enough of those, that starts to change perspectives. So the goal isn't to fight your doctor. It's to work with someone who can help you do this safely while both of you learn from the results. So let's come back to the original question. Is keto safe? For me, the answer is yes. Keto has been one of the most effective tools I've ever used to improve my health, my strength, and my quality of life. And based on my experience and what I've seen in others, I would go so far as to say this. For many people dealing with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic dysfunction, a well-formulated ketogenic or carnivore lifestyle may not just be safe. This lifestyle may actually be safer than the alternative you are now currently living in. Now, that doesn't mean it's perfect. It does not mean it's for everyone. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't assess your own risks. But it does mean this conversation deserves a hell of a lot more nuance. Because at the end of the day, The goal for every man, for every father, for every husband, for every son is to become a healthier, stronger, more capable version of himself over time. And the path you choose should move you in that direction. So, I want to hear from you. Have you tried keto? Have you tried carnivore? Has it worked for you or not? Drop your experiences in the comments down below. And if you're a man over 40 who is serious about becoming stronger, healthier, and more capable, go ahead and hit subscribe, please, because that's what we're going to do here on this channel is help men support other men to reach their health and metabolic goals. God bless.